Or okay, hello, welcome to our talk about death. I don't know, Cambria, do you want to introduce this night, or do you want me to just dive into it?
You can just go ahead and dive into it.
Okay. So I am Lauren Carroll, and this is Erin Morelli, and Cambria invited us to share tonight because, yes, it's that time of year that we see lots of skeletons around. So, you know, why not talk about death, which is what I get paid to do. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you learned something new today. All right. So I'm Lauren. I have two kids that go to Mountain Song, Henry and Jojo. I am a holistic funeral arranger at the Natural Funeral, but I've been a funeral director for many years, and I am the co-founder of Death Wives with Erin, and it's an educational group, and her and I teach classes on everything from how to be a death doula to how to plan your own funeral and pretty much everything in between. I left the funeral industry to educate about home funerals, kind of to say I never want anybody to use a funeral home again. And it was during that time that I met Erin. But education has always been probably the most important part of the death and dying spectrum of work. And this is Erin.
Hi guys, I'm Erin. I'm the other half of Death Wives with Lauren. I come from a death doula background and a birth doula background before that. I am a professional crier. We have a big emphasis on grief in our work. I'm kind of especially like picking up this time of year and going through the end of the year. I think there's a lot of value and even some best practices around that. So that's an important part of my work. I'm also a celebrant, so I do funeral services and write eulogies and try to honor people in memoriam. And I am the mother of two who are not students at Mountain Song. We live in the Denver area, and I have 4 cats.
I didn't talk about my pets. Geesh, I should have done that. I have 2 humans, 2 dogs, and 3 cats, and 5 chickens. So today we're just going to kind of give you an introduction to what is a death doula. Some of you may have heard that term. Some of you may not have. So we'll kind of explain who that is, what they do. And then we'll talk about home funerals. And then finally, we'll go into eco-friendly end of life, which is one of our passion projects, is taking care of the earth and thinking about what we want to do with ourselves when we are no longer living. I like this quote that we are all just walking each other home, because that's really what we're doing as humans together, but especially as a death doula. So I will hand it over to Erin here to kind of introduce everyone to what is a death doula, what's their role?
Yeah. So death doula is, it's highly relatable in the context of a birth doula. And that's really how I, many years ago, before I had heard the words death doula, came to kind of orient to what it was had been working as a birth doula for a number of years when my grandfather was dying in hospice, and I was privileged to be a part of his process and a part of his death, and just realized how applicable what I was doing as a birth doula was in that same space and how much care was needed there. So the easiest way to understand it is just kind of through a lens that transfers well from the birth doula world, but specifically a death doula or a death midwife, or sometimes called a thana doula, is a non-medical caretaker who assists in the dying process, much like a midwife or a doula does in the birthing process. It's often a community-based role, aiming to help families cope with death through recognizing it as a natural and important part of life. So there's a lot of keywords in there. I'll start with community-based role. It's a really important part of our ethos is that we believe that this is a space that can be demedicalized and kind of brought back into the home and done human to human and done within families, right? So it's community-based, and we try to keep our education accessible at a community level. For that reason, we don't want people to have to be overly credentialed to do this work. And then it's recognizing families, or I'm sorry, it's helping families to cope with death through recognizing it as natural and as an important part of life. As natural because it is, right? Not one of us will escape it, and our bodies know how to do it. It's our intervention and our contemplation, or our lack of contemplation, that causes, fear and disruption. But naturally, our bodies know how to do it. And as an important part of life, because we find it odd philosophically that we are a species and a culture that celebrate birth and birthdays and weddings and all of these holidays and celebrations and milestones, but we don't recognize our death as perhaps our most important celebration of life. And we think that there's space to do that for the people who also think that it's important. What care do they provide and when? So a death doula's role, the scope can be large. It can begin from the time a terminal diagnosis has been given. So as long as someone's contemplating death, or I would say even before that, just helping people to contemplate death in general would be under the umbrella of death doula work. But also during the dying process. And some death doulas offer postmortem care, so care after the person has died, such as cleansing and dressing the body or doing rituals. And then there are additional services that kind of run in tandem or often parallel to death doula work, like funeral planning, home funeral services, education, and support for the process of death itself, family care, grief support, and spiritual support.
I'm just going to say, a lot of people ask, like, well, do I need to have a nursing background, or do I need to have been around death to be a death doula? And the answer is no. I read recently another death worker put, if a neighbor came over and said, I really need to go to the grocery store, would you mind just sitting with my husband? Her husband's been on hospice. He has the hospital bed in the living room. You wouldn't hesitate to say, yeah, of course. You just stepped into the role of a death doula for many. And sometimes it's just sitting with somebody. And then it can be so much more. Like Aaron said, the spectrum of what you can do as a death doula is huge. But the main difference between a death doula and hospice is that it's a non-medical role.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions about that? You can do them in the chat or do the raise your hand feature if you want to.
Yeah, we're going to kind of pause between each subject if anybody does have any questions, or if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question. That's fine too. It's pretty casual. And if not, we'll move on to the next. So this is my passion as a funeral director. I started off at Swan Law. Everybody here is from Colorado Springs, I would assume. And then I was the main funeral director at Mountain View Mortuary. And they're corporately owned. So I don't know if everybody knows that, but Dignity Memorial, or SCI, owns a large portion of the funeral homes in Colorado, and definitely in Colorado Springs. So while working for them, I was selling packages, and I was seeing this displaced grief. I didn't really know how to explain it as a young funeral director, but I could see that families were grieving, but like not right, not well. They were coming back, for another person's funeral a few months later. Husband dies, a few months later, the wife dies, and they weren't well. And so I saw a documentary about home funerals, and I saw such a change in the family dynamics. I saw such a change in the grief, and just how beautiful it was and how sincere it was. It changed everything. So I went back to the funeral home and I said, I know about home funerals and I want everybody else to know about them. And I want families to know that they don't have to do embalming. And I was pregnant with Henry at the time, who is now a 6th grader. And they pretty much said like, no. So I said, okay, I'm going to go then. And Henry was maybe 3 months old when I took my home funeral course. And got trained up in Boulder, which I happen to now work for the woman who trained me at her funeral home. So it was full circle. But I knew I needed everybody to know this, because what does it matter if one person knows it and I tell a few people? I want everybody. So I started holding workshops. And the first thing that I always tell every single person, whether that you come to one of my classes or you're just having friendly conversation with me, as Cambria will know, I'll be like, hey, did you know embalming is never required by law? And I think that's kind of step one to a home funeral, is that it's completely natural and it's 100% safe and it's 100% legal. What we do is you have 24 hours before the body either has to be embalmed, refrigerated, or laid out with ice or some sort of cooling element. And so that's what we do with a home funeral. We use ice, dry ice packs. I've used only one time. I didn't have anything better, but I've used the blocks that you put in the kids' lunch boxes to keep it cool. That works. And that's the way we've always done it. We did that for, centuries of keeping our loved ones at home. We didn't have refrigeration back then. We didn't have ice. So we typically buried our dead within 24 hours, which is still tradition with Muslim and Jewish law. And it becomes, that's a whole other class. I'm not going to go that deep into it. But in home funeral cases, we use ice. They're 100% legal. You do not need a funeral home to participate in any way in the state of Colorado. A family can even file their own death certificate. They can get the permit for the burial or cremation. They can transport the body to the cemetery themselves. They can build their own casket. All of these things, I think, are beneficial for not just, there's this financial part that's great, but the peace and the dignity and just the honor that is taken away from us in the traditional funeral homes. I don't like calling them traditional because this work, a home funeral, is traditional. So we typically say the industrial funeral home or the commercial funeral home. I didn't put this here, but just a fun fact that SCI, Dignity Memorial, who owns many of the funeral homes here, they make about $2 billion a year off the funeral profits. And I, as a funeral director, got commissions for each package that I sold families. So it was very sales focused. And that obviously is not the case with a home funeral. And that's how we kind of look at death too. It's very medical focused and it costs money to stay in this hospital to keep you alive versus helping you die. That's kind of what the funeral industry has turned into as well. They took away what families knew how to do, a tradition that has always been human of ours, and then turned it into, money, a monetary job. So, Aaron, I would say this is probably, other than embalming is never required by law, that home funerals provide time for stillness and calm, giving space for acceptance, grief, and ceremony to take place after death has occurred. I think that this is where the displaced grief starts right here, is that there's this rush. When somebody dies, there's this emergent feeling that the body needs to get taken away. And I've seen personally firsthand as a funeral director, but also working in hospice, that when families aren't present for the death, if they don't get to see their loved one after they've died and view their body, that there is this break in understanding the death and the grief process. So even if you just want those first 24 hours, which legally anybody can do it, because it gives you time to sit there, to be with them. A lot of people at the end of their life may be in extreme pain. They may have had, cancer, they may have had dementia, they may have had all these other things that their body was just fighting, and you saw them be so uncomfortable for so long. And then when they die, peace comes over their body. And so just to sit and be present in that can kind of begin the healing process, I guess. There's grief and healing go hand in hand for a lot of things, but especially in death. And you don't have that time or space when you use a funeral home. Families would have to pay, first off, to use the funeral home for 2 hours, 4 hours for a viewing. And typically funeral homes will say, well, you have to be embalmed. So then they go through that process. Then they have cosmetics and outfits and all the other things. But then what I noticed is that the family is the one kind of on stage. The family is the one who everybody comes up to, gives their condolences to, and they don't have enough time to really be with their loved one, to really sit. And so with a home funeral, you have all the time that you want. You can go into the room at 2 o'clock in the morning and bawl your eyes out next to them, and nobody's going to tell you you can't. There's a lot of healing that takes place where we feel safe, and that's usually in our home. So, and home funerals are still culturally practiced throughout the world. I just like to say that because America, Canada, and Australia are the only 3 countries that even do embalming. Embalming is not done anywhere else. It is very American. There's even a book that came out in the late 60s called An American Way of Death, because the way we do death in America is so unusual compared to everywhere else in the world. And I'm going to get on my sociology degree soapbox here. I think because of that right there, the fact that we don't know how to grieve, we don't know how to do death, we don't know how to really process these kind of things, that we do have these murder, gun deaths, suicides, overdoses, addiction problems that are very high in America. Okay, off my soapbox now. Just means you got to be sad, guys. Let it out. Be with your grief, have your ceremonies, have the rituals around the person who died. Their death is a part of their story. So if you kind of push it under, you're never finishing their story, you're never finishing their book. Okay, before we move on, it looks like there's some questions in the chat.
There are. Would you like me to read them to you?
Sure.
All right. Virginia says, is death doula something that would need a certification?
Ooh, this is my favorite answer. No, very much no. So like Erin said at the beginning, we really believe that this is community work. This is family work. This is work for every single human being to be able to sit with somebody when they're dying, and it's not medical. So to put any sort of certification title on that, like massage therapy, there was a time when it wasn't certified, and then it went through a certification process. We don't ever want to see that happen for death doulas, because then it would become an industry again. It would become this for-profit thing, and you wouldn't be able to do it for your family and friends.
Right. We're kind of trying to democratize it, right? So we don't want to do that accidentally. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's that answer. So what we do have is like certificates of completion. So there's many courses out there. There's really expensive courses. We make ours really accessible, and they're 2 hours long. But yeah, you can have a certificate of completion, but we really don't ever want to see a certified death doula out there.
Next question. Oh, and then Miranda says New Mexico actually. So I don't know if that was related to Virginia's question asking about certification in New Mexico, but there isn't one there either.
Mm-mm. And embalming is never required in any state ever. If that was required, like talking about embalming, I've had a few people say, Oh no, I know for sure that in Texas, no, in 0 states is it required by law. A
None
funeral
of them.
home, 0. Um, it's against the Jewish religion to be embalmed. So can you imagine a funeral home saying, sorry, it's the law? um, but a funeral home can say it's their policy. The cool thing about that is families always have the right to move to a different funeral home. In that case, and a lot of funeral homes, I don't think funeral homes are evil, bad people. I know that we go into this work with open hearts. That's why we go into this work. But so many of them are uneducated to what is actually, I mean, I was a funeral director and I didn't know about home funerals. And now that's all I talk about because I was a professional in this work and didn't know about them. So I've spent many years getting all the information I can. And I actually do educate funeral directors now, which that's like Aaron knows. Anytime I see funeral directors sign up for our classes, I do a happy dance. Because that's really who needs this education too, is the people who do this professionally in their community already.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Chloe says she's curious about the home cemetery. Can you buy a certain amount of land to bury loved ones on your land?
Yeah. So there are certain rules, like if you want to have a family plot. Colorado is one of those anything goes states, you guys.
Really
At the
is.
very end, we're going to get to all the green options, and every single green option is legal in Colorado. I think we're one of the only states that every single thing is allowed. Even there's no like governing board for funeral homes. Excuse me, in the state of Colorado, which is very bizarre. I came from California and everything was like monitored 100%. Here it's like,
Do whatever you want.
do whatever you want, which
Yep.
is good for families who do want to do all these kind of things. So in conclusion, if I wanted to, I could bury somebody in my backyard. I would just have to get a permit from the state health department with the coordinates of where the burial takes place, but also know that that is registered now with the state, and that if somebody buys my house, maybe 2 generations down, they'll still know that there is a body in the backyard, and you'll have to dig it up most likely because most people don't want to inherit your skeletons, literally.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and it depends on location and if it's rural or in the city. If you live in a downtown city area, you probably should not bury your bodies in the backyard. 2 acres is what I've heard is kind of a standard, but it
Yeah,
not only by state but also by county. So you would have to keep.
exactly. Yeah. California is like a couple 100 acres, and typically it has to have been family land for over 100 years and like already have had a burial on it before. So each state is going to be totally unique, but Colorado is pretty flexible there.
And that
Any
was
other?
it. That's all on
Okay.
questions. Yep.
All right. So other than home funerals and death doulas, this is probably what the Death Wives is so passionate about. And it's because when I started doing my research, when I started learning about home funerals, I realized how much waste every single year. And I say waste, I shouldn't say that because I know that caskets serve a purpose at the funeral. They look pretty, and but it goes into the ground, period. I mean, it either goes into the ground or it goes into a vault and it's never seen again. And so of course this has a toll on the earth. So these are just some facts of what 1 year of conventional burials in the United States uses. 30 million pounds of hardwood, 2,700 tons of copper and bronze, 104,000 tons of steel, 1.6 million tons of reinforced concrete, and that's just for the burial vaults. So these items alone could build the Golden Gate Bridge every single year. So every year in America, we bury the Golden Gate Bridge. And concrete is actually one of the worst things that you could bury in soil. And most cemeteries, or at least most people think that a cemetery requires a concrete vault. So most people, I would say 90% of people who do a burial also include a concrete vault in that burial. The amount of wood that we use just to create the caskets is about 4 million acres of forest. That seems, it's hard to even imagine how much wood that is. But one thing that I thought was really important is that because we take that away, we're taking away our air too. We're taking away what we breathe. So not only are we getting rid of these trees, we're actually affecting our ecosystem. And that's 1 year. That's just in 1 year. And we could build 90,000 houses. I know in America, we have a huge homeless crisis right now. So imagine if we didn't use these caskets that were built by, once again, huge commercial industry casket builders, Batesville, for instance. If we could use those resources and actually build homes and take care of our communities, that would be amazing. Did you have anything else to add to what burial does, Erin?
I mean, you covered it with a lot of great data, but I would just tell people maybe the imagery of a cemetery, and I say this as someone who really loves cemeteries and always hung out in them and still hangs out in them, and I call them love museums. But you know, like the if you were to slice the land open and look at a cross section of it, it looks like a mouthful of cavities, just one after the next, of holes dug into the land that are filled with steel and concrete and chemicals. So the water table is disrupted. So any adjoining or adjacent land is potentially affected by that. So we just need to think about the impact of, of that. And then the question behind it being, kind of why do we do that? And the reason, the most simple reason, is we're trying to preserve ourselves. We're trying to prolong, decomposition essentially. And so then we ask, well, why are we doing that? And the short answer is that we somehow feel that there's division between us and nature, because animals and everything else kind of just returns to the earth. And so it's getting on board with this kind of train of thought where, why do we have to be separate from nature? And doesn't it make more sense to return to nature? And then you come to find out that here in Colorado, we're really excited and progressive about that and have provided like several ways to do it, which we're going to talk about, I think, next.
Yeah, that's all I would add. Perfect. And then
Can I add something, Lauren?
Oh, yeah.
So something people don't think about when they think about burial is the depth in which we bury our dead. It means that you don't decompose, because the organisms that help us decompose faster are only within the first 4 feet of the soil. So if we're burying 6 feet down, you're kind of
too deep.
Yeah, you're just in
a refrigerator.
Yeah.
A root cellar.
Great point, Kendra. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And like Erin said, it's kind of this idea of we're preserving ourselves. We have this separation that we don't want to think about, that we're returning to the earth, that we will decay, even though, people know ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Our idea of death and dying, and I wish I had a whole class just to talk about how did we get here? Yeah. How did we get to death like this in America? World War II and the Industrial Revolution. There's the short answers, because obviously we didn't embalm. Obviously we didn't have big steel caskets. Obviously we didn't put people in these grand vaults super deep into the ground. Something changed for those things to happen. And it really does press on what Erin said, of a mixture of kind of vanity of what death should be like, and that we're above it. We are above animals, we're above trees, we're above nature, which I think us mountain song parents can say, like, we understand that we're not. But one thing I often hear is like, well, I want to be cremated. That's the greener option. And the answer is absolutely not. No, cremation is actually, I would say, worse than burial. And I know that sounds wild, but it is. One cremation takes as much energy and gives off enough emissions and pollution as like a 1970s pickup truck driving 600 miles. That's one human body. Why do we choose cremation? Well, it's easy. We're mobile. It's affordable. People think it's a, it becomes a tradition. This says 53% of Americans use fire cremation. 76% of Coloradans right now choose fire cremation. And I think it's because they like, scattering ashes on top of Pikes Peak or at the favorite fishing spot. And we love that too. And there's an option where you can do the same exact thing, but with a much less environmental impact. Do you want to read or talk about some of those impacts that cremation does?
Sure. It releases tons of toxins into our environment, including mercury, which can be inhaled by funeral workers, especially because they're around it day in and day out. And then they end up in our ecosystem. The EPA has acknowledged how harmful cremations can be.
Here's a fun fact. So the EPA has stated forever that crematories can only be at a certain elevation because obviously the atmosphere is so much thinner up here that those emissions drop much quicker. And like Erin said, it's extremely harmful for those living around. So crematories aren't going to be in neighborhoods. They have to be in an industrial or commercial area only. So driving around, you probably won't see one. There's one on Astrazon off of Hancock Expressway in the middle of nowhere. There's a big crematory there if anybody wants to see one.
So think about that. If you think that your loved one is at this funeral parlor that's kind of mimics a house that, has little curtains and a little sitting area, and like in your mind, that's where you think they are. They've really been transported to a much more industrial space for cremation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for embalming if they're being buried traditionally in most cases.
So with that in mind, the EPA, like I said, had these really strict rules. So we don't have any crematories higher elevation than Colorado Springs until, and I'm not trying to get political, but when Donald Trump was president, he pretty much said, sorry, EPA, your rules don't matter anymore. So we had somebody get into that loophole and open up a crematory up north or out west, up in like Woodland Park Divide area. Which I'm friends with him, so it's okay, but he knows that he got away with something that the EPA said this is not safe. So just, keep that in mind while we discuss some options that are equal to cremation in a way, but much better for the environment. And then this last little picture down here just says, just in North America alone, we use enough fossil fuels for cremation to drive halfway to the sun. And if you don't know how far that is, I don't either. But that is a lot of fossil fuel. I know that we just watched Jeff Bezos shoot up in space and they showed how much energy he used in just that amount of time. Well, multiply that by a lot more. And that's how much energy we use just to do cremations in the United States. So, do we have any questions? Are there any questions, Erin? No?
Yeah,
No.
Chloe asked about the open air pyre in Crestone.
Yeah.
If the pollution is the same as cremation and levels of that.
No, because you use natural gas for the cremation and you get the flames to a certain heat. With the open air pyre, you're using juniper branches and wood and no, there's not the same emissions at all. As far as mercury fillings and that kind of thing, I have a feeling if you live in the Crestone community, you probably don't have mercury in your body. They're pretty organic down there.
And you do have to be a part of the community to have their services at the end of life. They don't open it up to anybody.
Yeah, so I do know people who buy land.
She says her sister's looking to buy land out there.
Yeah, if you buy land out there, you don't have to necessarily live there, but if you own a plot of land, then you get into that. And they have a great end of life, like collective group. They care for their own dead. They do their own home funerals. They transport the body out to the pyre. I mean, it's beautiful. I've only done a burial there in their natural burial ground, but I got to go to the pyre, and it was amazing. Amazing.
So Virginia also asked, she says, so if I want to be cremated, but I also don't want to poison everyone, what are my options?
Oh, well, we're about to tell you. So here are your eco-friendly end-of-life options available in Colorado. So typically, I don't know if I said this, but this is me and Erin's job as we educate. And when COVID happened, we started doing these teachings online. We had only done workshops in person up until then. And what we found out is that this is amazing, that we can reach so many people all over the world in a way that we never thought we could. So yeah, I added available in Colorado, and I was really proud to have this slide because this is our first only Coloradans, I think, that we've done in the last 2 years.
Wow.
So this first one is green burial. I managed a funeral home here in Colorado Springs up until February, or no, April. And we did green burials all the time in both Evergreen and Fairview Cemetery. Our city cemeteries have always allowed for green burial. Any cemetery that has a Jewish section, they allow for green burial because, like I said earlier, Jewish law, you're going to be in a biodegradable container. So usually a pine casket with no metal, and you're not going to be embalmed. That's green burial in a nutshell. There's no vault as well. So when people say, well, doesn't the cemetery? And I'm like, no, have you asked the cemetery? And they're like, no, the funeral home sold me the vault. Exactly. The funeral home sells you the casket. The funeral home sells you the vault. Both things that are never required at our city cemeteries. And kind of like funeral homes where they can have option, like they can say, well, it's our policy at our cemetery that you do have a vault. There's ways to work around it so it's more green. But a lot of cemeteries don't require and never have. People just don't go to the cemetery first to ask them. So green burial is just that. There's no embalming, there's no vault, and they're in a biodegradable burial container. This is a shroud burial. This is how I want to be buried ever since I was 19 and started working at my first funeral home. And this is probably by far the most popular choice for burial here in Colorado Springs that I've done, if you're going to choose the natural route. And you could be laid directly on the ground in this at both of our city cemeteries. So there's one green option. The next one is the one that I think everybody is thinking of, and Erin will cover this one.
Yeah, so the technical term is alkaline hydrolysis, but you can think of it as water cremation. So in the former cremation that we were talking about, the element that breaks the body down is fire and gasoline. But in water cremation, it is water and almost nothing else. It's usually about 95% water and 5% alkali, which is put like in soaps and lots of over-the-counter things, but is corrosive in, in volume and in quantity. And it kind of, speeds up decomposition, mimics what the ideal composition would be if, for example, like a deer were to die in the forest and fall into the river. What that decomposition would look like is being, idealized and mimicked in this vessel that you see in this picture. So the body goes into that vessel with the warm water and the alkali, and there are several different models of the machine. I think the quickest one processes the entire body from start to finish in 6 to 8 hours. This model that you're looking at here, that blows my mind. This model that you're looking at here takes more like 12 to 16 hours to break a body down. And then here's what's really cool about it. Besides the fact that there are no emissions, it takes very little electricity. It takes about as much water as somebody might use in a day of their life.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important thing to say is people, well, isn't that so much water? No, It's
Nope.
about 2 bathtubs full, or what an average family uses in one day.
Hmm. Yeah. And the way the process works is that it first it breaks down all of the soft tissues, so the skin and the organs, and those they're mixed with water and they become kind of a thick liquid, which is drains off into a separate chamber, and then all that's left is the bones. And that liquid that we're talking about is really nutrient dense. It's really, really good fertilizer for plants, for example. And so the places that are offering it here in Colorado are working with different farms and working with Colorado State University for testing in the labs, and it's really become like a progressive science experiment that we're doing here. And it's a cool completion of the circle of life too. You know, it's not just the practical aspect of like this is cool when it comes to regenerative farming, but it's also really cool spiritually that you're taking, you know, what you might think of as the final product or the end remains of a life form, and you're giving it back to the earth in a way that feeds it and that creates new life and that regenerates the cycle. So it's a really beautiful process. It's legal in 18 states, and here in Colorado, there is a farm called Half Moon Farm that receives the tea tree, and they grow beautiful flowers with it, and they provide flowers from their farm for funeral services, and they welcome the grievers to come and kind of do, you know, grieve there or work in the soil or meditate. So it's it's beautiful. It makes so much sense, but in comparison to what you think of as the commercial or the, you know, old school traditional funeral industry, it's very, very different.
And with fire cremation, you get ashes back. You do get ashes back again in this process. Like Erin said, the liquid is drained into another cylinder, and then what remains is the full skeleton. I have seen both fire cremation and water cremation. I work for a funeral home that also offers water cremation, and the process is night and day. And one thing that is the biggest difference is that the skeleton remains whole. It remains completely intact, and then it's dried because it is in a liquid, so the bones get dried out. And then just like fire cremation, they have to go through a pulverizer. It's against the law, or you're not supposed to at least have anything that actually looks like human bones. So it's crushed down into, you know, ashes look like kind of gray, chunky crumbles. But with alkaline hydrolysis, since it is literally just the bones, no clothes, no cremation container, all the extras that are required for fire cremation, you get pure white or almost pure white bone, the color of your bones. And then you get 20% more of these ashes than you do with fire cremation. And that's because you're not using this high intense heat that actually, you know, deteriorates some of these fine little fingertips that we have. So you get more ashes back, and you're using 90% less energy. So everybody who wants cremation, say, oh wait, I want water cremation. That's
Water
what I meant.
cremation, not fire cremation. We're really lucky to have this here. People are always like, you know, can I drive to Colorado to have it done? Well, yeah, it's a little harder, but that is possible. So we're
Sure
fortunate to
can.
have relatively easy access here.
Yeah. And like Erin was saying, the liquid remains, there's nothing human about it. And I think that that's also hard for us to wrap our heads around as a society. Just like we like to preserve death, make it look pretty, make them look like they're sleeping. We have this idea that, oh, that liquid, that's human, that's gross. You guys might be weirded out by this, but I've touched it and it's completely safe. And like Erin said, it is one of the best fertilizers out there. It is probably the best fertilizer out there. And many farms in Boulder County are already using it. Like Erin said, there's this amazing farm that Death Wives works with often that works exclusively with Be a Tree water cremation, which is this is Emily here in the picture with me and Erin, the owner, and she's always more than welcome or happy to talk more about this, let you come to her facility and schedule a tour. But yeah, it's pretty neat. That's pretty cool, and we're really happy that we that we know the people who do this.
Yeah, we are.
This is the newest one.
Does anybody have any questions about that one
Oh.
before we move on? Because now we're going to tell you about a totally different technology.
And we only have 10 minutes left. So, I mean,
Okay.
I don't know if there's really a time limit, but.
Okay.
All right. So this is now legal in 3 states. Washington and Colorado are the only 2 practicing so far, but it just became legal in Oregon as well. And it's called natural organic reduction, also known as human composting. We compost at Mountain Song, right? It's kind of the same thing. Human composting is the body is laid in a container with wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. And then the chamber is closed and some oxygen and water are, slowly added. And the heat source, lo and behold, is ourselves. All those nice gut flora that have kept us healthy for so long are the ones that are now eating us up. And they warm the body up to about 140 degrees naturally. And the process itself, depending on the facility, can take anywhere from 2 months to 9 months, just like any other composting process. The company that I work for, which is called The Natural Funeral, they are probably do the most traditional composting that there is. They built giant wooden composting barrels, just like we would use, that roll ever so slightly, and we keep rolling them. But it does take about 9 months for the full process. And when people say why, it's like, well, if you throw a whole banana in there versus like a cut up banana peel, which one is going to compost quicker? So when you're in a whole body, it is going to take a while, but the end process is completely natural. It's compost, it's soil.
No skeleton.
No skeleton, no DNA, nothing that mimics a human in any way. And the amazing thing about this is that the process itself, like when I talk about natural and green burial, I say no embalming, but Americans aren't that natural anymore. We do take a lot of medications. Some people go through, chemotherapy before death and have a lot of toxins in their body. Natural organic reduction, the natural process of it, destroys all of those things. Anything bad is destroyed in the process by ourselves, by the heat of our own body. So when you think about something really, really, really green, think about human composting. I don't know how much greener you can get. And then the only negative, I think, to the human composting law in Colorado, and this might sound really taboo, you can't use it to grow food. With the water cremation, the liquid is a fertilizer. So if you wanted to, you could grow food with it. By law, the leftover compost you're only supposed to use on shrubbery and trees. So we have had the very first person entombed and starting this process in Colorado, and his family plans on planting trees and using this compost and soil. And I hear people all the time say, oh, I want to be a tree. And they talk about those cremation pods where you put the ashes in and then you grow a tree from that. And I always have to be the person that breaks their heart and says, no, you'll kill the tree. That was like a song. Ashes are not good. Cambria, you told me once, though, that they are good for a certain plant. What plant would that be?
So in very, very small doses, things like tomatoes really will appreciate it, because you're essentially a calcium, you're a calcium supplement.
Doesn't do anything.
But just like if you took like 15 calcium supplements, it would be very bad for you. It's a matter of like dosage. So those like urn things are really, they want you to buy like 9 of them at $300 a pop, because they want like a tablespoon of ash each so you don't kill the tree. But yeah, anything, so like marijuana likes calcium, tomatoes like calcium, any of the nightshades.
But only small amounts. So I tell families, like, oh, we wanted to sprinkle that, we want to put a rose bush on top of grandma. And I'm like, don't do that. You will kill your rose bush. You need compost. You need something that's nutrient dense. And so this is your answer. Don't use ashes. If you want to do cremation, use the liquid byproduct, which Emily at Be a Tree calls it tree tea, because it is a tea that nourishes trees, and another way to be a tree. So sadly, fire cremation does not equal being a tree. I'm sorry, but natural burial would, natural organic reduction would, and the liquid products of water cremation do. So if we want to be a tree, these are the ways to go. And lucky us, all are legal in Colorado. So this is the end. Do you want to read it, Erin, or should we just...
Thank you for joining the conversation tonight about death. We know it can be a weird topic, but we also know that it is universal and that most people can appreciate opening up a space to discuss it. By talking about death, you are talking about life. It is life affirming. It helps you to be your true authentic self, and it helps you to make the best version of your finite life. You can learn more at our website. We do one core class a month. Those are really inexpensive. We do some free stuff. And then we do have a 3-month program for people that want to take a deep dive and learn how to walk with death.
Yeah. All right, I guess for the last few minutes here, if there's any other questions that we could answer.
You have a couple.
Okay.
Jasper wants to know if the skulls in the last picture are real.
Yes, I think, well, no, probably not. So here's a cool thing about skulls. If you have a real human skull, this is cartilage that's going to keep our jaw connected to our skull. So a real skull is not going to have the lower jaw. So if we have our Death Wives logo, it's just the top part of the skull because that's more natural. So if you see a skull sitting somewhere that has the jaw, it usually has wire or glue holding it together. I don't know why. I just had to tell everybody that fact.
It's a good fact. Give them some like good party facts, you know, for your
Halloween skeleton facts for y'all.
Embalming is never required by law. Real skeletons don't have a lower jaw.
You could be composted in Colorado.
Yeah.
Throw all these facts out to all your friends at the parties this Sunday.
Okay, and then Virginia asked, she said, so you mentioned this or used the wording, nothing that mimics the human body. So is this a thing? Are we not supposed to get back things that resemble humans once someone is gone?
So yes, if you do the natural organic reduction, you only get soil back. If you do water cremation or fire cremation, you get ashes back. At the end of the process, like I said, it's a skeleton. A fire cremation skeleton is broken up and in pieces and burned in chunks. Water cremation is a very gentle process, and the like Erin was saying, it mimics decomposition. So the flesh drops from your bones, but you're left with a full skeleton. But after both of those processes, the skeletons have to be crushed up, and that's what ashes is.
So I actually, from art history, know why we can't get back skeletons or why the law started. So during the Holocaust, people were taking bones from burning large amounts of Jews as like rewards for it. And so they made it illegal to own bones in most of the, own full bones in most of the world, except for a couple of Asian countries and
Hawaii.
South American. Oh, and Hawaii. Yeah, if there's other reasons, but most of the like European and United States made it illegal so that they could find people who took like spoils of war.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, it does. You taught me something though. Thank you.
Any other questions? Is that the last one? Yes.
I think it is.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this very unique and interesting talk, and we hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Lauren.
Oops. You're welcome. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.